The espresso machine hissed like an angry serpent as Sarah Martinez slammed the portafilter into place for what felt like the 1,000th time that morning. 6 a.m. had rolled into 7, then 8, and the line at Cornerstone Coffee hadn't shrunk by a single person, her fingers moving on autopilot, with muscle memory taking over where her exhausted brain couldn't keep up anymore. Pump the syrup, steam the milk, pull the shot, repeat. The rhythm was supposed to be soothing. They'd told her during training 3 years ago, but right now it felt like a prison sentence with no end in sight. Her feet screaming in protest inside her non-slip shoes, the same pair she'd been wearing for 6 months because new ones weren't in the budget, not with Mia's hearing aids needing replacement and the rent going up another $100 next month. The order tickets kept printing, that mechanical sound that used to mean job security but now just meant more work, more pressure, more customers sighing dramatically when their triple-shot half-caff oat milk extra hot no-foam latte took longer than 30 seconds to materialize, and Sarah caught her reflection in the chrome of the espresso machine between orders and barely recognized herself. When had those dark circles become permanent fixtures? When had her hair started showing gray at 28? She pushed the thoughts away because thinking led to feeling and feeling led to crying, and she absolutely could not cry at work again, not after last time when Marcus had pulled her aside and given her that talk about maintaining professionalism during shifts. The bell above the door chimed again and Sarah didn't even look up. Another customer, another complicated order, another opportunity to mess something up and get yelled at someone who thought their coffee was the most important thing happening in the world that day. She finished the current drink and called out the name that was probably misspelled on the cup and reached for the next ticket. Her hands were shaking slightly, a combination of too much caffeine exposure and not enough sleep, because Mia had been up half the night again, frightened by something Sarah couldn't hear, some sound that only a child with hypersensitive hearing aids could detect, and they'd sat together on the worn couch until 3 in the morning, Sarah's hands telling stories in the dim light of the living room, spelling out tales of brave princesses and magical forests, until her daughter's eyes finally grew heavy and sleep claimed her. Now Sarah was paying the price, her body running on fumes and desperation, her mind fuzzy around the edges like a photograph taken slightly out of focus. The next order was simple, thank God, just a black coffee, and she poured it quickly, her hands steadier now that she didn't have to operate the complicated machinery. She handed it off and finally allowed herself to glance at the clock. 4 more hours until her break, 4 more hours until she could sit down, 4 more hours until she could check her phone and see if the elementary school had called about Mia, if there had been another incident, another problem, another thing she'd have to deal with on top of everything else. The morning rush finally started to ease around 9:30, the desperate pre-work crowd giving way to the leisurely late-morning customers who actually had time to sit and enjoy their drink, and Sarah used the brief lull to wipe down the counters, her movements mechanical and efficient, born from thousands of repetitions. She was restocking the cup lids when she felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck that meant someone was watching her. She turned slowly, half expecting to see Marcus ready to critique her station setup, but instead found herself looking at a man she'd never seen before. He was sitting alone at the corner table, the spot usually reserved for the regulars who came in with laptops and stayed for hours nursing a single drink and occupying valuable real estate. But this wasn't a regular. This man wore a suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. Charcoal gray, with subtle pinstripes that caught the light when he moved. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and he was staring at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Not the creepy kind of staring she'd learned to deflect with practiced disinterest, but something else, something she couldn't quite identify, recognition maybe, or confusion, or both. Sarah broke eye contact first, turning back to her work because standing around staring at customers was definitely not in the employee handbook, and she couldn't afford to lose this job, no matter how much her feet hurt or how tired she was, or how much she sometimes fantasized about walking out the door and never coming back. Robert Chen hadn't planned to stop at this particular coffee shop. His driver had suggested it after the morning meeting ran long, and Robert realized he'd skipped breakfast again, a habit his doctor kept warning him about. At 63 he couldn't afford to skip meals anymore, couldn't push his body the way he had during the early days when he was building Chen Technologies from a garage startup into a multinational corporation worth billions, so he'd agreed, stepping out of the Mercedes into the cool morning air, telling his driver to circle the block, because this would only take a few minutes. He'd walked in expecting generic coffee and maybe a pastry, nothing special, just fuel to get him through the rest of the day. But then he'd seen her, the woman behind the counter, moving with that particular kind of exhaustion Robert recognized from his own mirror on bad mornings, had turned to grab something from the back counter, and her hands had moved in a way that made Robert's heart stop. It was unconscious, he could tell, gesture. She probably didn't even realize she was making, but he'd seen it. The sign for tired followed immediately by the sign for okay, a private conversation she was having with herself in a language most people couldn't see. Robert's coffee sat untouched on the table in front of him, growing cold while he tried to process what he'd witnessed. His hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white, and he forced himself to relax, to breathe, to think rationally about what this meant. It had been 30 years since Robert had seen anyone use sign language casually, naturally, as part of their everyday existence. 30 years since his sister Margaret had died in the car accident that had also claimed his parents, leaving Robert alone at 33 with a struggling business and grief so profound it had nearly destroyed him. Margaret had been deaf since birth, a bright and brilliant soul who navigated the world through her hands and eyes, and Robert had learned to sign before he could write. Growing up bilingual in English and ASL, they'd been inseparable, Robert and Margaret, partners in crime and best friends, and when she died, Robert had locked away that part of his life like a photograph in a drawer, too painful to look at, too precious to discard. He'd thrown himself into work, into building the company, into becoming the kind of success story that business magazines wrote articles about. He'd married twice, divorced twice, accumulated wealth beyond measure, and somewhere along the way he'd forgotten what it felt like to see hands dancing through the air telling stories without sound, until today, until this exhausted woman in a coffee-stained apron had unconsciously signed to herself and cracked open a door in Robert's heart he'd thought was sealed forever. He needed to know. The compulsion was irrational, unprofessional, completely unlike him, but Robert Chen hadn't built an empire by ignoring his instincts. He stood up, his expensive shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor as he approached the counter. The morning rush had ended and only a few customers remained scattered around the small shop like islands. The woman, Sarah, according to her name tag, looked up as he approached, and Robert saw the automatic customer service smile appear on her face. The same smile he'd seen on thousands of service workers over the years, polite and meaningless and exhausted. He ordered another coffee he didn't need, watching her hands as she moved, looking for more evidence that what he'd seen was real, and not some grief-induced hallucination brought on by too many late nights and too much stress. She made the drink efficiently and professionally, and handed it to him without any additional hand movements, and Robert felt disappointment wash over him. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe the past was playing tricks on him, showing him what he wanted to see instead of what was actually there. He was turning to leave when a phone buzzed loudly on the back counter, and Sarah glanced at it, and Robert saw her entire body tense. She picked it up, looked at the screen, and her face went pale. Her hands moved then, quick and unconscious, signing no, no, please no, before she seemed to catch herself and shoved the phone in her pocket. She called out to someone named Marcus in the back, her voice shaking slightly, saying she needed to take her break right now, immediately. It was an emergency, and Robert watched as she disappeared through a door marked employees only, and made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him. Robert Chen, Billionaire CEO, master of the boardroom, walked over to the young man at the register and asked a question that was absolutely none of his business. He asked about Sarah. He asked if she was okay. He asked in a way that suggested he was willing to pay for the information what her story was, and Mark, who was 22 and studying business at community college, and recognized opportunity when it walked through the door in a $5,000 suit, told him everything he knew. Single mom, deaf daughter, struggling, always taking extra shit. She never complained, but everyone could see she was drowning. Robert listened to every word, his mind already working, already planning, already seeing possibilities that Marcus couldn't begin to imagine. Sometimes fate handed you opportunities disguised as coincidences, and Robert Chen had learned long ago never to ignore fate. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the phone as she stumbled out the back exit into the alley behind Cornerstone Coffee, the same alley where she usually took her breaks, sitting on the concrete steps and eating whatever she could afford from the convenience store next door. But today there was no food, just the phone call from Mia's school and a sick feeling in her stomach that was spreading through her entire body like poison. Mrs. Patterson, the school nurse, was using her kind voice, the one that meant something was wrong, but she was trying not to panic. The parent on the other end of the line, Mia had fallen on the playground, nothing broken, but she'd hit her head and they really thought someone should come pick her up just to be safe, just to make sure everything was okay. And oh, by the way, had Sarah noticed that Mia's hearing aids were making that feedback noise again? They'd tried to adjust them, but maybe it was time to get them looked at by a professional. Sarah had closed her eyes and counted to 10 in her head before responding, her voice steady, even though her heart was racing. Yes, she'd come get Mia. Yes, she knew about the hearing aids. No, she didn't need them to call an ambulance. She'd be there as soon as she could. 15 minutes maybe, 20 at most depending on the bus schedule. She'd hung up and immediately gone to find Marcus, explaining the situation in rapid-fire sentences, while her brain calculated how much this was going to cost her. Missing 4 hours of her shift meant 4 hours of lost wages, which meant the electric bill was going to be late again, which meant another late fee she couldn't afford. The hearing aid situation was worse because the last time they'd needed servicing it had been $300 even with the insurance, and that was 6 months ago when they were still under warranty. Now the warranty was expired and Sarah had no idea how she was going to pay for repairs, let alone the replacements the audiologist had mentioned at the last appointment. She sat on the concrete steps and let herself have exactly 30 seconds to fall apart, her face in her hand, her shoulders shaking with tears. She couldn't afford to cry. 30 seconds of weakness, of terror, of overwhelming exhaustion and fear, and the desperate knowledge that she was failing. She was failing her daughter. She was failing at everything that mattered. Then she stood up, wiped her face with her apron, and straightened her shoulders because Mia needed her, and falling apart was a luxury she absolutely could not afford. The bus ride to Mia's school took 23 minutes, each one stretching longer than the last. Sarah sat in the back watching the city slide past the dirty windows, trying not to think about all the ways this day was falling apart. She'd been so close to making it work this month, so close to having enough for rent and utilities and food and the minimum payment on the credit cards that were maxed out from the last time Mia had gotten sick and needed medications their insurance wouldn't cover. She'd picked up every extra shift Marcus offered, had survived on ramen and black coffee, had sold everything she owned that wasn't absolutely necessary. The TV had gone first, then the few pieces of jewelry from her grandmother, then the books and clothes and anything else that might bring in a few dollars at the pawn shop on 5th Street. She was running out of things to sacrifice, running out of ways to make the math work, and now this, another expense, another crisis, another reminder that no matter how hard she worked or how carefully she budgeted, it was never enough. Mia was sitting in the nurse's office when Sarah arrived, a small figure with a Hello Kitty backpack and a bruise blooming purple on her forehead. She looked up when Sarah walked in and her hands moved immediately, signing rapidly, telling her mother about the playground and the mean boy who'd pushed her and how her head hurt. But she was being so brave, wasn't she being brave? Sarah dropped to her knees and pulled her daughter into a hug that was probably too tight. Breathing in the scent of children's shampoo and playground dirt and home, she signed back, her hands moving through the familiar patterns, telling Mia yes, she was so brave, the bravest girl in the whole world, and everything was going to be okay. It was a lie. Sarah knew it was a lie. But what else could she say? Your mother is drowning and doesn't know how to save us. Your hearing aids need repairs we can't afford. We might lose the apartment next month if I can't figure out how to make rent. No, children deserved better than the truth. Sometimes, children deserved to feel safe, even when safety was an illusion constructed from desperation and determination. Sarah signed again, asking if Mia was ready to go home, and her daughter nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. Mrs. Patterson handed over paperwork about concussion symptoms to watch for, her eyes sympathetic but tired, because she'd seen 1,000 struggling parents and knew there was nothing she could really do to help. Sarah thanked her, took Mia's hand, walked out of the school, wondering how much longer she could keep all the pieces of their life from falling completely apart. Sarah was holding Mia's hand as they walked back toward the bus stop when she saw him, the man from the coffee shop, the one in the expensive suit who'd been staring at her that morning, and her first instinct was to turn around, to avoid whatever this was, because men in suits didn't wait outside coffee shops for struggling single mothers, unless something was very wrong. But he'd already seen her, was already walking toward them with purpose, his expression serious but not threatening, and Sarah found herself stopping, positioning herself slightly in front of Mia in a protective gesture that was pure instinct, her free hand moving to sign to her daughter to stay close, stay quiet, let mommy handle this. The man stopped a respectful distance away, not crowding them, not making Sarah feel trapped, and when he spoke his voice was gentler than she'd expected, educated and careful, the voice of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms learning to read people and situations. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, and Sarah recognized the name immediately, because everyone in the city knew who Robert Chen was, the tech billionaire whose company had revolutionized cloud computing, whose face appeared on magazine covers and business shows, whose net worth was discussed in terms that Sarah couldn't even comprehend. He said he'd been at the coffee shop that morning, had seen her hands move, had recognized the language, and Sarah felt her stomach drop because she'd been so careful not to let anyone at work see her signing, afraid they'd think she was distracted or unprofessional or different in a way that might cost her the job she desperately needed. Robert continued talking, his words coming faster now, saying he knew this was strange, knew he had no right to approach her like this, but his sister had been deaf, had used sign language her whole life, and seeing Sarah's hands move had brought back memories he'd buried for 30 years. Sarah wanted to interrupt, wanted to ask what this had to do with her, what he wanted, why he was telling her this, but something in his expression stopped her, a raw vulnerability that seemed completely at odds with the expensive suit and the billionaire status, and everything else. Then Robert said something that made Sarah's world tilt sideways. He said he wanted to help, that he had resources and connections, and he'd learned from Marcus about her situation, about Mia, about the hearing aids and the struggles, and he wanted to offer her something. Sarah's first reaction was anger, hot and immediate, because who was Marcus to share her private business with strangers? Who was this man to think he could just swoop in and fix her life like she was some charity case, some project to make himself feel good? But then Robert held up his hands in a gesture she recognized, signing, "Please just listen," in perfect ASL, and Sarah's anger stuttered and stopped. He wasn't doing this for publicity, he wasn't looking for recognition or credit. He'd have his lawyers draw up papers making everything anonymous if she wanted. He just needed to do this, needed to help, because seeing her hands move had reminded him of Margaret, had reminded him of a part of himself he'd lost, and maybe helping Sarah and Mia was really about healing something broken inside himself. He pulled out a business card, wrote a number on the back, and held it out to Sarah, his hand steady even though she could see emotion flickering in his eye. He said the number was how much he wanted to put into a trust fund for Mia, for her education, for her hearing aids and medical care, for whatever she needed, and when Sarah looked at the number her legs nearly gave out. It was $2 million, written in neat, precise numbers that couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of joke or scam or fever dream, brought on by stress and exhaustion. Sarah looked down at Mia, who was watching the interaction with curious eyes, not understanding the words but reading her mother's body language the way deaf children learn to do, sensing the tension and confusion and fear. She looked back at Robert, at this stranger who was offering to change their lives completely, and tried to find her voice, tried to form words that made sense, but all that came out was a whisper, asking why, just why, what did he want from them, what was the catch, because there was always a catch. Robert's expression softened and he signed his answer, his hands moving through the shapes that Sarah knew as well as breathing, telling her there was no catch, no expectations, no strings attached. He just wanted to help a mother take care of her deaf daughter, the way his parents had taken care of Margaret, the way someone should have been able to help his sister if things had been different, if she'd lived long enough to need it. The tears came then. Sarah couldn't stop them, didn't even try. They ran down her face while Mia tugged at her hand, asking what was wrong, why was mommy crying, and Sarah dropped to her knees right there on the sidewalk and signed to her daughter that everything was okay, better than okay. that sometimes miracles happened when you least expected them, that maybe they were going to be all right after all. Robert Chen wasn't a fool, despite what his impulsive offer on the sidewalk might suggest. He'd built a billion-dollar empire by being careful and methodical and never making decisions without complete information, which was why he'd hired Thomas Reeves, the best private investigator in the city, to do a complete background check on Sarah Martinez before signing any papers or transferring any money. Thomas had done this kind of work for Robert before, vetting potential business partners and investigating merger targets, but this was different, more personal, and Robert had been specific about his requirements. He wanted everything, every detail about Sarah's life, her history, her character, anything that might indicate whether she was genuine or running some kind of long con that Robert's grief-addled brain had fallen for. The report came back 3 days later, 78 pages of dense text and supporting documentation, and Robert read it in his home office, overlooking the city, his coffee growing cold as he absorbed every detail of Sarah Martinez's life. She was 28 years old, born in Phoenix, moved to the city 6 years ago following a man named David Chen, no relation, who'd promised her a life together, and then disappeared 3 months after Mia was born, leaving Sarah alone with a newborn who'd failed her first hearing test, and a mountain of medical bills that insurance barely covered. She'd worked a dozen different jobs trying to make ends meet: waitress and retail clerk and house cleaner and anything else that would hire a single mother with no college degree, and a baby who needed constant medical attention. She'd never been arrested, never been sued, never done anything worse than accumulate credit card debt, trying to pay for Mia's hearing aids and speech therapy and all the other expenses that came with raising a deaf child alone. The investigator's report painted a picture of someone who was drowning but kept swimming anyway, someone who showed up for every shift and paid every bill she could and sacrificed everything for her daughter. The neighbors in her building described her as quiet and polite, always saying hello, occasionally accepting hand-me-down clothes for Mia but never asking for anything. The teachers at Mia's school called her involved and caring, showing up to every parent-teacher conference despite having to take time off work she couldn't afford to lose. Thomas had even interviewed Marcus from the coffee shop, who'd said Sarah was the hardest worker he'd ever met, never late, never called in sick even when she probably should have, took every extra shift available, and the only time he had ever seen her cry at work was when a customer had complained loudly about the wait, and Sarah had apologized so profusely, it was painful to watch. Robert read through the financial section with growing dismay, Sarah's bank statements showing a desperate juggling act of minimum payments and overdraft fees, money coming in from the coffee shop, and immediately going out to rent and utilities and daycare and medical bills, never anything left over, never any margin for error or emergency or hope. She had $47 in her checking account and negative $200 in savings, her credit cards were maxed at their limits, and she was 3 weeks away from eviction if she couldn't make next month's rent. The numbers didn't lie, and they told a story of someone who was doing everything right and still losing, someone who worked full-time and still couldn't afford basic necessities, someone the system had failed completely. The report included a section on Mia that made Robert's heart ache. The little girl was 7 years old, profoundly deaf in both ears, born 3 months premature, which had caused the hearing loss. She'd been fitted with hearing aids at age 2 and learned sign language alongside spoken English. Her teachers said she was bright and creative, struggling a bit with reading, because she couldn't sound out words the way hearing children did, but excelling in math and art, making friends despite the language barrier. There was a note from Mia's audiologist stating that her current hearing aids were outdated and losing effectiveness. She really needed new ones fitted specifically for her growing ears, but the cost was prohibitive and insurance would only cover a portion. Estimated expense was $8,000 for a new set, and that wasn't including the routine maintenance and battery replacements and adjustments she'd need over the coming years. Robert finished reading the report as the sun was setting over the city, the sky turning orange and purple outside his floor-to-ceiling window, and he knew with absolute certainty that his instinct had been correct. Sarah Martinez wasn't running a scam, wasn't trying to take advantage, wasn't anything except a good person trapped in an impossible situation that she'd done nothing to deserve. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer, gave instructions to draft the trust fund documents immediately, make it $3 million instead of $2 million, establish monthly disbursements for living expenses, plus a lump sum for immediate needs like the hearing aids and back rent. Make it ironclad and anonymous and set up so Sarah couldn't refuse it or give it back even if she tried. His lawyer, who'd been handling Robert's affairs for 20 years, asked if he was sure about this, if he'd really thought it through, and Robert said yes, he was absolutely sure, probably more sure than he'd been about anything in the last 30 years. This was something he needed to do, something Margaret would have wanted him to do if she were still alive to tell him. When he hung up the phone, Robert walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights beginning to appear in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably finishing a shift at the coffee shop, probably exhausted and worried about Mia and calculating bills in her head, trying to figure out how to make impossible math work out to something survivable. She had no idea her life was about to change completely, had no idea that a chance encounter and an unconscious hand gesture had set in motion events that would alter everything. And Robert felt something he hadn't felt in 3 decades, something that felt almost like peace. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier service that required Sarah's signature and ID verification before handing over the thick manila envelope, and Sarah had signed for it with shaking hands, sure it was a lawsuit or eviction notice or some other disaster she'd been waiting for, but hoping wouldn't come. She'd waited until Mia was at school before opening it, sitting at the small kitchen table in their apartment, the same table where she paid bills and helped with homework and ate meals that were usually just pasta or rice or whatever was cheapest that week, her fingers fumbling with the envelope seal, her heart pounding with dread. Inside were legal documents, pages and pages of dense text with official seals and signatures, and it took Sarah 3 attempts at reading the first page before her brain could process what she was seeing. The words kept sliding around, refusing to make sense. Trust fund, beneficiary, $3 million disbursement schedule, all of it stamped and notarized and completely impossible. She read it again, then again, looking for the catch, the fine print that would explain this was conditional on something she couldn't provide, or a mistake that had been sent to the wrong address. But the documents were clear and specific. They listed Mia's name and birth date, listed their address, included details about hearing aids and medical expenses that only someone who'd investigated them thoroughly could know. There was a letter attached, separate from the legal documents, and Sarah opened it with trembling hands. The paper was heavy and expensive, the kind rich people used for important correspondence, and the handwriting was neat and precise, clearly written by someone who'd taken time and care with every word. The letter was from Robert Chen, starting with an apology for the unorthodox approach and the invasion of privacy that the background check represented, explaining that he'd needed to be sure, needed to know that his instincts were correct, and the investigator's report had confirmed everything he'd suspected. Robert wrote about Margaret, about growing up with a deaf sister, about learning sign language before English, and navigating a world that wasn't built for people like his sister, about the countless small and large barriers that society put in the way of deaf individuals trying to live their lives. He wrote about the car accident that had taken his family, about the 30 years of guilt and grief and throwing himself into work to avoid feeling anything, about how seeing Sarah's hands move had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was sealed forever. The letter explained the trust fund structure, how Sarah would receive monthly payments to cover living expenses and Mia's needs, how there was money set aside specifically for hearing aids and medical care, how there was enough for Mia's education through college and beyond, how all of it was legally binding and couldn't be revoked or challenged by anyone, including Robert himself. He'd structured it so Sarah couldn't refuse, couldn't give it back even if she wanted to. The money was Mia's now, held in trust with Sarah as guardian, and the only requirement was that it be used for Mia's benefit and well-being, however Sarah defined. Robert ended the letter by saying he didn't want thanks or recognition, didn't want to be part of their lives if Sarah didn't want him there. He just wanted to help, wanted to make sure that Mia had the opportunities Margaret never got to experience, wanted to know that somewhere in the world, a deaf child was being taken care of the way his sister should have been, if fate had been kinder. Sarah read the letter 4 times, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the paper. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Miracles were for other people, for the lucky ones, not for exhausted coffee shop workers, who were always one crisis away from complete collapse. But the documents were real, the legal seals were real, the letter was real. And when Sarah finally let herself believe it, really believe it, the sob that came out of her was something primal and overwhelming. 38 months of terror and exhaustion, and desperate determination finally finding release. She put her head down on the kitchen table and cried, really cried. Not the quick 30-second breaks she allowed herself in back alleys, but deep racking sobs that shook her entire body, crying for every meal she'd skipped to make sure Mia ate, for every bill she'd juggled, for every night she'd lain awake calculating impossible math, for every moment she'd felt like she was failing her daughter, despite doing everything humanly possible. When Mia came home from school that afternoon, Sarah was still sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by tissues and legal documents, her eyes red and swollen, but something different in her expression, something Mia hadn't seen before, something that looked almost like hope. Sarah signed to her daughter to come sit down, that Mommy needed to tell her something important, and Mia climbed into the chair across from her with the seriousness of a child who knew when adults were dealing with big things. Sarah's hands moved slowly, carefully, explaining in sign language that they'd been given a gift, that a kind man had decided to help them, that they didn't have to worry about money anymore, that Mia could get new hearing aids, the really good ones that would help her hear better, and they wouldn't lose their apartment, and everything was going to be okay now. Really okay, not the pretend okay that Sarah had been signing for months while everything fell apart around them. Mia's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, hope, joy, and finally she asked the question Sarah had been asking herself all day, signing why would someone help us? And Sarah signed back the only answer she had, that sometimes good things happened, sometimes people were kind for no reason except that they could be, sometimes miracles were real. Mother and daughter sat at the kitchen table as the afternoon light faded to evening, making plans for the first time in forever, actual real plans that weren't just about survival but about living, about the future, about possibilities that had seemed impossible just that morning. And Sarah felt something shift inside her, felt the constant weight of panic and fear start to lift, felt herself begin to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be all right. Sarah hadn't wanted to meet Robert Chen, had been perfectly content to accept the gift and never see him again, maintaining the comfortable distance of anonymous benefactor and grateful recipient. But 3 weeks after the trust fund documents arrived, she'd received another letter, handwritten again, asking if she'd be willing to have dinner, just once, just to talk. He understood if she said no, but he'd appreciate the chance to explain himself more fully. She'd almost thrown the letter away, almost ignored it completely, but something about the careful handwriting, the obvious vulnerability in the request, made her reconsider, and eventually she'd called the number on the card he'd given her that first day, and left a message saying yes, she'd meet him, but somewhere public, somewhere safe, and she was bringing Mia, because she didn't have anyone to watch her daughter, and couldn't afford a babysitter even with the trust fund money, which she still hadn't really touched except to pay for Mia's new hearing aids. Robert had suggested a restaurant downtown, expensive but not intimidating, the kind of place that had a children's menu and didn't make people feel uncomfortable if they didn't know which fork to use, and Sarah had shown up 15 minutes early, wearing the best outfit she owned, which was still clearly not fancy enough for the surroundings, Mia holding her hand and staring wide-eyed at the crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. Robert was already there, sitting at a corner table with a view of the city lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk, and when he saw them approach he stood immediately, his expression nervous, in a way that seemed completely at odds with his billionaire status and expensive suit. He signed a greeting to Mia first, asking her name, and complimenting her new hearing aids, which were purple and sparkly because those were the ones she'd chosen when Sarah said she could have any color she wanted. Mia signed back shyly, telling him her name and that she was 7 3/4, not just 7. The 3/4 were very important, and Robert smiled in a way that made his whole face change, made him look younger and less intimidating, more human. They sat down and there was an awkward moment where nobody knew quite what to say, the weight of what Robert had done hanging over the table like fog, and Sarah found herself studying him properly for the first time, noticing the lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and late nights, the gray, in his hair that he didn't bother to dye, the expensive watch that probably cost more than Sarah used to make in a year, but also the vulnerability in his expression, the way his hands kept moving slightly as if he wanted to sign something but was holding back. Sarah spoke first, her voice quiet but steady, saying she didn't know how to thank him, didn't know if thanks were even adequate for what he'd done. It had changed their lives completely. Mia had her new hearing aids, and they'd paid off the back rent and bought actual groceries, real food, not just pasta and canned soup, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah had slept through the night without waking up in a panic about bills. Robert's hands moved then, signing as he spoke, saying he was the one who should be thanking her, that seeing her use sign language had given him back a part of himself he'd thought was lost forever, that he'd been so focused on business and success and achievement, that he'd forgotten what really mattered, what Margaret had always known mattered, which was connection and family, and using whatever resources you had to make other people's lives better. He told them about Margaret properly then, not just the brief mentions from the letter, but real stories, signing and speaking simultaneously, so both Sarah and Mia could follow, talking about how his sister had been fearless and funny, how she'd refused to let being deaf limit her in any way, how she'd taught Robert that disability wasn't a weakness, but just a different way of experiencing the world. Margaret had wanted to be a teacher, Robert, his hands moving with practiced fluidity, that came from decades of disuse finally being remembered. She'd wanted to work with deaf children, to be the kind of teacher she'd wished she'd had growing up, but she'd died before she could finish her education degree, before she could make that dream real, and Robert had always wondered what impact she might have had if she'd lived. Seeing Mia, seeing this bright, creative child who was being given opportunities Margaret never got, it felt like completing something, like honoring his sister's memory, in a way that actually meant something beyond the charitable foundation donations and scholarship funds he'd set up in her name. Sarah listened and watched his hands move and felt something shift in her understanding of this situation. This wasn't about charity or guilt or even kindness. Not really. This was about grief and loss and a man trying to find meaning in a tragedy that had shaped his entire adult life. This was about Robert trying to give Mia the future his sister never got to have. Mia tugged at Sarah's sleeve then, signing that she was hungry, and the moment broke, became normal again, became just 3 people having dinner together, and Robert ordered half the children's menu when he couldn't decide what Mia might like, making her giggle when 5 different plates arrived all at once. They talked through dinner, conversations flowing more easily now, Robert asking about Mia's school and her friend, Sarah asking about his business and whether it was really as exciting as it seemed on TV, and gradually the strangeness faded, replaced by something that felt almost like comfort, like the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Robert signed to Mia about his sister, telling her stories about Margaret's adventures, about the time she'd convinced Robert to sneak into a movie theater, and they'd gotten caught, about how she'd once presented an entire school report in sign language, and made the teacher learn ASL just to grade, and Mia laughed and signed back with increasing confidence. This man understood her language, understood her world in a way most adults didn't. As dessert arrived, 3 different kinds because Robert still couldn't choose just one, Sarah found herself asking the question she'd been holding back all evening, asking what Robert wanted from them going forward, whether this dinner was meant to be a regular thing, or a one-time meeting to put faces to names, what the expectations were, because Sarah needed to know, needed to understand the boundaries of this strange new relationship. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his hands still, his expression thoughtful, and when he finally answered he signed it rather than speaking it, his hands moving slowly and carefully through the shapes Sarah knew so well, saying he wanted nothing except to know that Mia was okay, that she was getting what she needed, that the trust fund was being used the way it was intended. He didn't want to intrude on their lives, or demand gratitude or insert himself where he wasn't wanted, but if they were willing, if Sarah was comfortable with it, he'd like to be a presence in Mia's life, not as a father figure or replacement for anything, just as someone who understood what it meant to grow up alongside deafness, someone who could be there if Mia ever needed advice or help, or just someone to talk to who wouldn't treat her hearing loss as something tragic or limiting. Sarah looked at her daughter, at Mia's face lit up with joy as she demolished her 3rd dessert, chocolate smeared across her chin, and then looked back at Robert, at this unexpected person, who'd appeared in their lives like something from a fairy tale, and she signed her answer, saying yes, that would be okay, more than okay actually. Mia could use more people in her life who understood her well, who signed fluently and naturally, who saw her as a whole person rather than a disability, to be managed or overcome. Robert's expression transformed, tears actually welling up in his eyes, and Sarah realized with a start that he'd expected her to say no, had been bracing himself for rejection, for Sarah to take the money and cut off all contact, and her yes had meant more to him than the trust fund had meant to her, which seemed impossible but was somehow true. They finished dinner as the city lights blazed outside the window. Three people from completely different worlds, who'd been brought together by chance and sign language in grief and hope, and when they finally left the restaurant, Mia holding both their hands and swinging between them, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt like maybe they were going to be okay, like maybe the future held possibilities instead of just struggles, like maybe this strange new chapter of their lives was going to be something beautiful. 5 years had passed since that first dinner, 5 years that had transformed everything about Sarah and Mia's lives in ways that went far beyond the financial security the trust fund provided, though that security itself had been life-changing, allowing Sarah to finally go back to school part-time, studying to become a speech therapist specializing in deaf education, a career path that felt like destiny now, using her experience raising Mia to help other families navigate similar journeys. Mia was 12 now, thriving in a specialized program for deaf and hard-of-hearing students, her sign language fluent and beautiful, her spoken English improving with the better hearing aids. Robert had insisted on upgrading every year as technology advanced. She'd made friends, both hearing and deaf, had discovered a passion for art that manifested in paintings full of color and movement and emotion that couldn't quite be captured in words. Robert had become a fixture in their lives, not intrusive but present, showing up for school events and art shows, taking Mia to museums on weekends when Sarah had to work or study, teaching her about business and technology and the world beyond their neighborhood, always signing, always remembering that Margaret had wanted to teach deaf children, and now he was getting to learn from one instead. The relationship had evolved into something none of them could have predicted, not quite family but more than friendship, a bond forged from shared language and mutual need, and the strange alchemy that sometimes happened when grief and hope collided. Sarah had worried at first about Mia getting too attached, about what would happen if Robert got bored or busy, or decided this project of healing his past wasn't working anymore, but those fears had faded over time as Robert proved himself reliable and constant, showing up when he said he would, remembering the small details that mattered, treating Mia not as a charity case or a replacement for his sister, but as her own person, worthy of attention and care simply because she existed. Today they were at the park, the three of them celebrating news that had arrived that morning in a thick envelope with a university seal. Mia had been accepted into a summer program for gifted students, a prestigious art intensive that Sarah never could have afforded before the trust fund. Robert had insisted they mark the occasion properly. They sat on a bench under cherry trees that were dropping pink petals like snow, and Mia's hands moved excitedly as she signed about the program, about the classes she'd take and the projects she'd create and the other students she'd meet, her face glowing with the kind of joy that came from knowing her dreams were actually possible, actually achievable, not just fantasies to be locked away as impractical. Sarah watched her daughter and felt her throat tighten with emotion, remembering the terrified, exhausted woman she'd been 5 years ago, standing in a coffee shop and juggling impossible math, trying to figure out how to give her daughter any kind of future at all. She'd been so focused on survival then, on just making it through each day, that she'd almost forgotten to hope for anything better. Robert's hand squeezed her shoulder gently, and when Sarah looked up at him, she saw her own emotion reflected in his face, pride and joy, and something deeper, something that looked like healing, like the slow, careful process of learning to live with loss instead of being destroyed by it. He signed to Mia, asking about her plans for the program, and Mia responded enthusiastically, her hands dancing through the air with the confidence of a child who'd grown up knowing that her language was valid and valuable, not something to be ashamed of or hidden. Sarah remembered the first time she'd seen Robert sign, that day outside the coffee shop when her world had been falling apart, how his hands moving through familiar shapes had seemed impossible, too good to be true, and now here they were, 5 years late, three people who shouldn't have fit together, but somehow did, bound by sign language and second chances, and the strange grace of unexpected connections. The afternoon stretched out golden and warm, and they talked about the future, about Mia's art and Sarah's studies and Robert's plan to establish a scholarship fund specifically for deaf students pursuing careers in STEM fields, something Margaret would have loved, something that would help more families like Sarah's find their way out of impossible situations. Mia eventually wandered off to the playground, still young enough to want to swing, despite being almost a teenager, and Sarah and Robert sat in comfortable silence, watching her play, both thinking their own thoughts about how much had changed, and how much had stayed the same. Sarah broke the silence first, signing as she spoke, telling Robert that she'd never properly thanked him. Not really. Words felt inadequate for what he'd done, for the life he'd given them, but she wanted him to know that she thought about it every day. Every time Mia laughed or learned something new or talked about her dreams for the future, Robert's response was immediate, his hands moving before he even spoke, saying he was the one who should be grateful, that they'd given him back a part of himself he'd lost. That being part of Mia's life had taught him more about what really mattered than 30 years of business success ever had. Margaret would have loved Mia, would have loved watching her grow up confident and creative, and completely unafraid of her deafness, and in a way, through this strange arrangement, through this unexpected family they'd built, Margaret was still here, still teaching him, still making the world a little bit better. They sat together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Sarah felt a peace she'd never expected to find, the kind that came from knowing that sometimes life surprised you, sometimes the universe conspired to bring the right people together at exactly the right moment, sometimes a single gesture, an unconscious movement of hands, signing tired but okay, could change everything. Mia ran back to them as the light faded, signing that she was hungry, and they all laughed because some things never changed. 12-year-olds were always hungry, and they gathered their things and headed toward the parking lot, Robert offering to take them to dinner, somewhere nice, somewhere they could celebrate properly. As they walked, Mia between them again holding both their hands like she had that first night 5 years ago. Sarah caught Robert's eye and signed a simple thank you, and he signed back "You're welcome, but also thank you," because this had saved him too, had given him a purpose beyond building companies and accumulating wealth, had reconnected him to the sister he'd lost, and the life he'd almost forgotten was possible. The cherry blossoms continued to fall around them, pink petals catching in Mia's hair and on their shoulders, and Sarah thought about how 5 years ago she'd been drowning, desperate and that she was failing, and now she was here, walking through a park at sunset with her daughter and a man who'd changed their lives, talking about college programs and art intensives and futures that were bright and full of possibility. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she was young, wasn't the fairy tale ending that children's books promised, but it was real and beautiful, and more than she'd ever dared to hope for, and that Sarah thought as they reached the car and Mia chatted excitedly about dinner options. That was more than enough. That was everything.